Hi, everyone. The new semester is starting in a couple of weeks, and probably a lot of you are starting to think about how to teach their classes in the spring and how to design their syllabi and their assignments. And one thing that is new this semester is that recently a very powerful large language model has entered the scene called Chat GPT, which can write a whole bunch of different kinds of text. And this opens up a lot of opportunities for students to use it in completing their assignments. And so in order to get you up to speed about what that means for teaching, I'm recording this short presentation to give you some idea of what Chat GPT can do and what you need to be thinking about when you're designing your classes for this coming semester. So I'm going to talk about what Chat GPT is very briefly. Then I'm going to talk about why it's a problem for how we teach our classes and assess student learning. And then at the end, I'm going to give you some suggestions about what we can do about it. So what is Chat GPT? It's a large language model developed by a company that's called OpenAI. And it can generate text in response to a large variety of prompts. So it can write you stories, cooking recipes, screenplays, suggestions for how to decorate your living room, but it can also write the sorts of essays that we ask our students to write in our classes. The way this model works is that it has been trained on a very large data set of texts, and it generates new text by making statistical predictions about what should come next based on its training data. The training data is running up to about 2021. So if there's content that is from last year, the model probably doesn't know about it. But I think it's just a matter of time before the model is going to have access to the internet. So I think within not too long, we can expect that it actually can access things that are more current than 2021 as well. Because it's a large language model that is relying on making statistical predictions based on its training data, it actually has no idea if the content it generates is accurate or whether the content it generates over multiple responses is consistent. But at the same time, since the training data is often pretty good, that means a lot of the content it generates is also pretty good. If you want to try it out for yourself, you can see there's a link that you can go to. You can sign in with a Google account. It's very easy, and you can start playing around with it if you like. I'm going to just show you what it can do in response to some common prompts that we might give our students. So these are just screenshots from content I generated by using the model. So I asked it if it can give me a valid argument that has a false conclusion, and it's doing a good job here explaining what's happening here. I think if a student gave this kind of answer, that would maybe not be an A answer, but it would certainly be a passing answer. I asked it how a Stoic and an Epicurean approach to life differ. It had a little short essay here. I'm not going to read it all to you. You can pause the presentation and read it if you like, or you can play with it yourself. But again, maybe not the height of literary achievement, but pretty good. You can also ask it to explain things at different levels. So here I asked it to explain the Euthyphro dilemma for a second grader. So it's explaining it in particularly simple language. And again, I think it's a pretty good explanation. Also, it can summarize articles as long as the articles are currently in its training data. So I asked it to give me a 300-word summary of Judith Thompson's paper in defense of abortion. And I think it did a quite decent job here. And you can also tell it like how long of a summary you want, or you can ask it to keep going. Another thing I had to do was I pasted in an introduction to a paper or a book chapter that I was working on, and I asked it if it could improve it and rewrite it for me. And it did that. I mean, you can read the two versions and think about whether you think the AI did a good job. I actually think it made the text slightly more concise. It didn't alter the content in any worrisome ways. So again, right? A student even who might be writing their own text could feed the text into Chat GPT, and Chat GPT could clean up the spelling and the grammar and sort of wordiness and things like that for them. Another thing that's interesting, and this has recently changed, I think, is some people give their students kind of experiential prompts where they're supposed to connect the content of the class to their everyday life. So I'm asking it, talk about a time in which you faced a moral dilemma in your everyday life. A few weeks ago when I tried this, it just said basically the thing at the beginning, I'm an AI, I don't have experiences, I can't answer this. But now it's actually suggesting that it can give me kind of some general answer. And in the past, when I did that, when I changed the prompt slightly and said, talk about a time in which a person might be facing a moral dilemma in their life, it would also give me an answer. So you can't get around this by asking people about their personal experiences, because a very slight tweak to the prompt will generate an answer that the student can then submit if they want. Here's another example. Give me 3 examples of common cognitive biases that impair people's reasoning, and add citations. Here we actually see something interesting, because even though the definitions of these cognitive biases are pretty good, all the links, when you click on them, are dead. And generally speaking, ChatGPT is not very reliable at providing accurate citations. So this is something, even though these links look pretty plausible, they don't lead anywhere. So generally speaking then, what ChatGPT is quite good at is answering general questions about content that's not too obscure. And those are really similar to what you might ask on a take-home short essay exam, right? So if you had questions on your take-home exams like, explain what virtue ethics is and give an objection to it or something like that, ChatGPT is going to be able to do that. It can also summarize articles as long as the articles are in the training data. And it seems like a lot of very famous philosophy papers that are older are in the training data. It can also rewrite short passages of work and edit for spelling and grammar. And it can also write things like experiential essays and things like that. Sometimes the student who wants to use ChatGPT to cheat on things like that might need to tweak the input a little bit in order to get what they want. But ChatGPT can definitely deliver this. What it's currently bad at is answering questions about content that's not in the training data or that requires some internet access, or summarizing or editing really long texts that are not in the training data. Right? It's not very good at providing accurate links or references, right? The links in the thing that in the question about cognitive biases were all dead. And it can't document or justify its reasoning or its editing process, right? It can't say, oh, I edited this sentence or changed this way because of this. It's just a statistical model. It can't explain what it does. And so for that reason, it's also bad at completing stepwise assignments that expand on earlier work. So for example, if you had an essay assignment that went from say, a very short thesis to write sort of longer assignments that sort of build and incorporate feedback, that's not something that ChatGPT can do. It could perhaps assist the student with it, but it couldn't just generate it all on its own. So, well, what do we do about this? So in the past, right, we've been able to detect at least many forms of plagiarism by using standard plagiarism detectors like Turnitin, but those are not going to work for Chat GPT. The other thing is, what you can't do is, run, say, a take-home exam through Chat GPT, see what it says, and then compare the students' answers to the output, because the system doesn't necessarily repeat the same answers. So for example, when I asked it to give me a valid argument with a false conclusion, and I did that 3 times, I got 3 different answers. And especially if the student tweaks the wording of the prompt a little bit, they're likely to get something different from what you generated when you tried it out. So you can't just, use that as a proving mechanism against plagiarism. Right, so here's another example, right? I say, give me an example of a valid argument with an untrue conclusion, and here I get a completely different argument than I did the first time, and the explanation is also not exactly word for word the same. There is a website too that's supposed to be a plagiarism detector for AI. The problem is that these AI detectors only give you a statistical probability that a text is real or a fake. And while they're pretty good, they're not foolproof. So I fed the Euthyphro answer and the Thompson summary into it, and they were spotted as 99% likely to be AI generated. But just from seeing anecdotally on Facebook from people who've been trying this, apparently sometimes the detection software misses text that was AI generated. And sometimes it actually claims that human generated text was AI generated. Also, I fed it the edited version of my chapter introduction, and it was deemed 99% likely to be real. So apparently, if you take a human-generated text and feed it through the detector, through the Chat GPT to revise it, it still comes out as real, which you may find okay. I don't know. You have to think about your course policies for that, if they're allowed to use the software to edit their writing. But if you wanted them not to do that, you couldn't use the AI detector to detect if they've done that. One thing we really don't know at this point is how the Honors Council will respond to data about the statistical likelihood that a text was AI generated, right? So if you get an essay from a student, you feed it into the software and it says, I don't know, 95% likelihood of being AI generated. If the student just denies it and says they wrote it, I'm not sure there's anything you can do about it, and I don't know what the Honors Council will say about that. So based on this, I think the kinds of assignments that are especially vulnerable to cheating with Chat GPT are short essay take-home exams and quizzes, then also essays that are written at home about relatively common topics, literature summaries or responses that are about fairly standard texts. Of course, any type of text can be edited with Chat GPT. And Chat GPT can also do creative writing tasks. So for example, I asked it to turn the Nicomachean Ethics into a screenplay, and it gave me something. I thought it was a little painful, but it did it. So you can't just say, oh, write me a dialogue or write me, a short story. It'll do that too. Well, what are we going to do about that? Well, I think it's going to be really difficult to make an entire class cheat-proof against this. But at least one thing we can do is think about how to make it harder for students to use the software to cheat. One thing I wouldn't recommend is just going on as usual and trusting that you'll just be able to see when content has been AI generated. I think it's not easy. Maybe it's because it's like too perfect in terms of not having typos and having really good grammar. But of course, a student could fiddle with that a little bit and actually just build in some errors to make it look more human, right? So I think if we're trying to rely on the current technology and methods we have to just detect the cheating and report it, I think that's going to be difficult and painful. You might consider actually incorporating the use of Chat GPT into your assignments, right? So where students actually have to complete certain tasks with it and think about the output. The other thing is, I've heard a lot of people talking about how if they just make their prompts more obscure or are more vague about where to find the material that students are supposed to write about, like say something like, respond to the argument we discussed in lecture on Wednesday or something like that. That will make it harder for them to cheat with Chat GPT, but I think that also would lead to the assignments being really hard for the students to do, because they would then also find it difficult to understand it. And of course, it would also make it harder for students with disabilities to figure out what they're supposed to do. So when you just think about that, think about, are you now just trying to modify the assignments to make them escape kind of Chat GPT, or are you still thinking about sort of the pedagogical value of designing the assignment that way? There are still some assignments that are pretty cheat-proof, right? So anytime the students have to do writing in class without using the internet, so quizzes or written exams, those they won't be able to use Chat GPT because, of course, they don't have the internet. We might consider bringing back oral exams, at least for small classes. Presentations, right? So either delivered live in class or recorded, because it's, even if the student used the chat software, it's pretty difficult to present something that you don't understand and that you haven't written. So I think that helps to some extent. It also helps to have assignments that require a lot of researching and documenting the sources, because we saw that Chat GPT actually isn't that great at that, or that at least it's not reliably giving us sources that are still accessible and that are actually real. Also, if you have assignments that require multiple steps of development in which the students must document their reasoning, for example, where you ask them to develop an essay over multiple stages and maybe have them meta-reflect on their process, that could also be an assignment that's harder to use Chat GPT for it to cheat. Currently, I think you can also get around it by assigning content that's very new, because it wouldn't be in the training data. But that's only going to work until Chat GPT gets access to the internet, and then it's just going to be up to date. You can also think about assigning work based on content that's not written. For example, a recorded play or a podcast or a YouTube clip. The problem again is the technology will probably eventually catch up with that. And also by giving students content that has no written format at all. So for example, a podcast that doesn't have a transcript or a YouTube clip that doesn't have subtitles, it raises accessibility issues again that might make that option not entirely feasible or attractive. Another possibility, of course, is also to have assignments that have to follow a very particular set of instructions, or that you give a very detailed grading rubric for, where the output of Chat GPT wouldn't necessarily know to follow that rubric. But of course, again, a possible complication here is that if you make your rubric or your instructions Baroque and weird enough, it might also make it really difficult for the students to complete the assignment. I asked ChatGPT how to design writing assignments that are difficult for it to do, and we can see what it recommends. So what we get here is the suggestion of using highly creative or open-ended prompts, incorporating complex language or vocabulary, require original research, request personal experiences or reflection, and ask for emotional responses or connections to personal values. The funny thing here, right, is that, of course, because this is a statistical model and that is slightly out of date, it means that some of these are no longer true, right? So for example, using highly creative or open-ended prompts, if you try it out, you'll see that ChatGPT can totally do that. The problem with complex language or vocabulary is that, of course, if it's complex and obscure enough, your students won't understand it either, right? Requiring original research or analysis, there, I think that's what we said, right? Currently, it's not very good at like documenting sources and things like that. But as we saw, if we ask for personal experiences or reflections, ChatGPT can deliver something that the student could easily turn into, an essay that says, oh, this is what happened to me, rather than, ChatGPT just saying, oh, this is what could happen to a person. So, so it can do that. And similarly, when it comes to asking for emotional responses or connections to personal values, I think with the right prompt, ChatGPT can definitely deliver some content here. Maybe nothing too deep, but then again, plenty of students have passed the class with a B- for writing a pretty shallow essay. So if that's what the student is aiming for, I think ChatGPT can definitely deliver that. So here we kind of see that ChatGPT is unreliable, but versatile. There are also some ideas I've come across online for incorporating Chat GPT into assignments. You find some more ideas under that link over there. So one idea that I thought was interesting was to have students basically develop a rubric by which they would judge whether Chat GPT actually is, giving good answers to various questions. You could have the students experiment with different prompts and figure out which prompts generate good outputs and why. And also students could write by starting with output from Chat GPT and then track their changes that they make, their revisions, and explain their decisions. So depending on what you're teaching, if you want to teach kind of more sophisticated writing, that could be a good way to get the students to kind of like engage with the output of Chat GPT and kind of making it their own and improving it. Okay, that was my short summary. I hope you find it helpful. And yeah, I'm curious to see how this will go next semester. For myself, I'm planning to maybe replace some more take-home writing assignments with in-class writing assignments for my critical thinking 1440 class. But yeah, I haven't thought about how in the future I'm going to adapt classes that are more writing heavy and that require papers and essays. So if you come up with some good suggestions, I would love to hear them. And that's it for now.